There is a moment that happens in silence, and almost no one talks about it. You have just walked away from a conversation, a gathering, or perhaps simply a room full of people who love you, and yet something inside you is quietly unraveling. You hold it together long enough to close the door. You wait. You listen for footsteps. And only when you are completely certain that no one is watching do you allow yourself to feel what you have been carrying for hours, sometimes days. The tears come not with drama, but with an exhausted kind of relief. And in that private moment, you are more honest with yourself than you have been all day. If you recognize that experience, you already understand something profound about a certain kind of emotional architecture, one that is far more common and far more psychologically complex than it appears on the surface. People who cry in private are not, as the popular assumption goes, simply introverted or emotionally suppressed. The behavior runs much deeper than temperament. It is, in psychological terms, a learned emotional strategy, a finely constructed inner system built over years, often beginning long before the person had the language to understand what they were building or why. Think of emotional expression as something like a house. Most people grow up in environments where the doors and windows of that house are left at least partially open. Feelings move in and out relatively freely. Vulnerability is met with warmth. Grief is allowed to breathe. But for others, and this is where the story becomes more complicated, the early emotional environment was different. Perhaps the windows were shut too often. Perhaps tears were met not with comfort, but with correction. Perhaps sensitivity was framed as weakness, emotion as inconvenience, and openness as something faintly embarrassing. And so, with quiet efficiency, the person learned to take their feelings underground, not to destroy them, simply move them somewhere private. This is not a failure of emotional development. It is an adaptation. And like most adaptations, it was genuinely intelligent at the time it was formed. Here is what psychology reveals about the interior world of people who live this way. On the outside, they tend to appear composed, reliable, even cheerful. They show up. They listen. They hold space for other people's pain with a kind of patient generosity that others often take for granted. They are the ones who notice when someone in a crowded room looks slightly off. They remember details others forget. They ask the question no one else thought to ask. And all of this attentiveness, this careful observation of the emotional landscape around them, is not accidental. It is what happens when someone has spent years learning to read the room for safety, learning to sense whether the emotional temperature around them is one in which they can afford to be seen. But something interesting happens when you look closer. Beneath that composed and attentive exterior, these individuals are often among the most emotionally sensitive people in any given space. Small words land heavily on them. A particular tone of voice can stay with them for days. They replay conversations in careful detail, searching for the moment where something went wrong, wondering whether they said too much or too little, whether they were understood or quietly misread. Their minds do not move on easily. They hold things, not because they are weak, but because they feel with unusual depth and precision. This is where a particular psychological tension lives, because the very sensitivity that makes them feel so much is also the sensitivity they have learned, through long experience, to keep carefully out of sight. The pattern often begins early. Research in developmental psychology consistently shows that children who are told, explicitly or implicitly, that their emotions are too much, too dramatic, or simply unwelcome, do not stop feeling. They simply stop showing. They internalize what was once an external response. And this internalization becomes, over time, so automatic that many people who cry in private genuinely forget they are doing it. They do not experience it as concealment. They experience it as simply how things are, as if privacy and emotion have always been naturally paired, like sleep and darkness. But there is a cost, and this is where the architecture begins to show its weight. When emotion has no sanctioned outward channel, it does not dissolve, it accumulates. The private crier carries, over days and weeks and months, a quietly growing interior weight. Not any single unbearable thing, but the slow accumulation of everything left unsaid, every feeling that was held rather than released, every moment of pain that was managed alone rather than shared. And this is why, when the release finally comes, it so rarely feels proportionate to any single event. The tears that arrive in private are not about one thing. They are about everything at once. a kind of full exhale from a body that has been breathing in for a very long time. There is something worth understanding about what loneliness means for people like this. It is not the loneliness of social isolation. They may have close relationships, warm friendships, and people who genuinely love them. But they live with a subtler and more insidious form of solitude, the loneliness of being surrounded by people and still not feeling fully seen. Because connection, real connection, requires not just presence, but a certain kind of mutual transparency. And the very habit that protected them for so long now quietly stands between them and the depth of intimacy they actually crave. This is the psychological paradox at the center of this experience. The wall that was built for safety begins, over time, to feel like a prison. Not dramatically, not all at once, but gradually, the person becomes aware of a strange exhaustion, not just from carrying their emotions alone, but from the sustained performance of being fine, from the effort of appearing okay when they are not, from the gap between who they are in private and who they allow the world to see. And yet, and this is perhaps the most important thing to understand, there is genuine wisdom encoded in this pattern, even alongside its cost. People who have learned to sit with their own pain privately often develop an extraordinary capacity for self-reflection. Because they cannot easily outsource the processing of their emotions, they develop, usually without realizing it, a rich and nuanced inner life. They become skilled observers, not just of others, but of themselves. They learn the terrain of their own mind in ways that people with easier access to external processing sometimes never do. The private grief becomes, paradoxically, a kind of interior education. The question, then, is not how to dismantle this pattern entirely, because much of what it built has genuine value, but how to understand it clearly enough to choose it. To recognize when the habit of emotional privacy is serving you, and when it is simply running on autopilot from a time when the conditions were different. The door was kept shut because the outside was not safe enough to open it. But the conditions may have changed more than the habit has. What this kind of person often needs is not to be told that vulnerability is beautiful or that opening up will heal everything. That kind of language tends to arrive too quickly before the deeper recognition has settled. What they need, first, is simply to have the pattern named, to understand that what they have built is not a character flaw, not a sign that something in them is broken or permanently closed. It is, instead, the elegant and costly product of an emotional intelligence that learned to protect itself before it had any other options. And perhaps the most quietly radical thing such a person can do is simply to begin telling the truth about this, not necessarily to the world, but to themselves. To acknowledge that the composure is real, and the sensitivity is real, and the loneliness is real, and the exhaustion is real. That none of these things cancel each other out. That you can be the one who holds everything together for everyone else, while also being the one who weeps alone in the dark. That both of those people are equally you. The door was closed for a reason. Understanding that reason is the first and perhaps most essential step toward choosing carefully and on your own terms, when it might be safe to open it again.